Frenkie de Jong, Pedri. In an age where football teams resemble efficient machines, these two play to a very different rhythm. So what makes them so special, and do they expose a fatal flaw in how most clubs approach team building? Before we talk about this crucial partnership at the heart of Barcelona, I want to let you guys know about a crucial partner in my workflow as a creator, and that's Opera Browser, the sponsor of today's video. When I'm writing these videos, it's really important to stay in the zone and distraction free, and a bunch of Opera features really help me to do that. For example, with split screen, I can simply pull down one tab next to another and work on two tabs side by side without opening multiple browser windows, so I can keep my script open while checking some data. But then we also have Aria, Opera's built-in AI tool. Open up Aria's command line with Control or Command +/ and you can have any question answered right there on the same page, which again is super useful for preventing distractions. If I just need to double check something, I can do it without leaving the current tab where you risk getting dragged into all kinds of distracting content. And Aria can actually help me with tab organization too. For example, I can get all my YouTube tabs grouped together in a tab island. You can also group related tabs manually and then expand and collapse them to reduce clutter. And to top it off is the floating music player. Since I always listen to music while working, having those controls right there is really convenient and allows me to keep my entire workflow within the browser. You can move the player wherever you want, even outside the browser screen, and you can choose your streaming service of choice. So for a super slick and streamlined workflow, be sure to download Opera today using the first link in the description. The science of football tactics has never been better understood. Armed with footage, data, and content, you don't have to work in the game to understand what a team is trying to accomplish. Of course, this is no surprise. Football tactics are designed by people to be executed by people. A clearly defined system can be understood, internalized, and carried out efficiently. And as teams have better understood how to break down defenses, many have settled on clearly defined possession shapes, with 5 or 6 players occupying the vertical channels, and a structure behind for control and counterpressing. More than basic shapes, these often act as exact blueprints for the players to follow, strategically designed to dismantle opponents, pinning certain players, drawing others out of position, and ultimately creating a numerical advantage, a free man that allows you to attack. Naturally, as players adhere more strictly to positions, so their roles can become more precise. Wingers become 1v1 specialists, 8s become masters of the half spaces, each component engineered to achieve a global goal. But of all the parts, one might be considered the most important of all, the engine that keeps all the other components ticking along. In positional football, that crucial part is commonly known as the pivot, the centerpiece of the positional machine. In fact, that classic quote about Sergio Busquets wasn't just made because he was a genius, but because he was the living representation of Pep Guardiola's positional philosophy. Watch Busquets and the internal laws of the machine reveal themselves, the positional discipline, the constant formation of triangles, and the creation of the free man. It's no exaggeration to say that entire projects can live or die on the competence of their pivot. But of course, not every coach shares this philosophy. If football is trending one way, it's away from rigid blueprints and towards more dynamic approaches, in some cases greatly loosening those positional references. And when that happens, the machine's internal laws drastically change. Parts interact in different ways, and the metronome of the whole operation, the pivot, must play a very different rhythm, which is where today's protagonists come in. Pedri and Frenkie de Jong could be considered the engine of Hansi Flick's Barcelona, but they operate far outside the parameters of typical pivots. Now, Flick's Barcelona are an interesting team, because on the surface, they look quite straightforward. In fact, they appear to use those typical possession shapes. When it's a midfield 2, Pedri de Jong are the 2 pivots. If it's just one, you'll find Pedri slightly more advanced, but still responsible for dropping in during build-up. But there is an important detail here, because while the players have these positional references, they are looser than in many more rigid setups. Rather than strictly occupying points on the pitch, the players often shift their focus, prioritizing their connections with each other. So while they're still able to create numerical advantages, they also find advantages even if everyone is marked, by playing through the opponent with combinations. And that difference changes the whole dynamic of the team, which is illustrated perfectly by the roles of Pedri and de Jong. For example, positional pivots tend to be extremely precise with their, positioning. In settled possession, you'll usually find them next to or behind the opposition forwards, not going to the ball to receive its feet, but remaining within the opposition block. That ensures they retain numerical advantages in midfield. It also means that as the ball circulates, they remain the central hub of possession, never far from connecting with the next pass. As Guardiola once said, the holding midfielder has to be there. Don't move, be there. Pedri and De Jong, on the other hand, are frequently dropping to receive the ball to feet, picking it up outside of the block and then starting to dictate play from there. But that's not all. While pivots tend to circulate with as few touches as possible, De Jong and Pedri can be found dwelling on the ball for quite some time. Not just circulating, but carrying through zones. And if the pivot remains the constant base of attack, De Jong and Pedri dare to break forward even as the deepest midfielder. Comparing these two roles then, you can see the traditional pivot respects a very specific set of rules and parameters, while Barca's midfielders are afforded a far greater degree of flexibility, presenting a broader decision-making canvas, and creating rhythms that are less predictable. Which of course sounds like a great opportunity, but depending on how you view the game, could also be considered a huge risk. A less defined role with more potential decisions comes at a cost, because while it might make your possession less predictable, for some coaches it would also make it inefficient. Spending too long on the ball, for example, or driving forward with no cover would be considered unacceptable in some game models, creating instability not just for your opponent, but for your own teammates. However, having access to more decisions does give these two players a very unique responsibility, because rather than adhering to a set of principles that governs the whole team, their decisions become the animating force of Barca's football. The pivot, the mechanical metronome of the machine, becomes alive. But what do I mean by that? Well, let's consider Frenkie de Jong and Pedri as footballers. Of course, they're both quality technicians, but what typifies them is a quality often known as pausa. That is, their propensity to almost pause in possession. Not rushing, but delaying in order to make the best decision. And when you combine this with their positional flexibility, that pausa becomes a fundamental essence of Barcelona's possession, as they pick up the ball in all areas and dictate the game in a very measured rhythm, slowing, assessing, changing the direction of attack. That might seem inefficient, especially if you're used to seeing a pivot quickly cycling the ball, but of course, here they're relying on the positional discipline of the entire team, where players fill spaces automatically to retain passing options. But as positions become less precise, the picture around you changes, and you have to take in different information. So that extra degree of consideration becomes useful as you search for the route that maximizes combinations and threat, even if that means playing into a more congested area. This influence over the rhythm and flow of Barcelona's football is why for me this partnership feels so alive. Using those extra degrees of freedom, they balance possession in a way that feels personal and spontaneous. On the ball, they are constantly adjusting the dynamic, often bringing calm and stability when necessary. However, they can just as easily choose to disrupt that stability, abandoning their roles as pivots in order to make the team less predictable. You'll see Pedri in particular do this a lot, drifting from left to right to disrupt the opponent. So step back and we really have two very different ways of constructing a team dynamic. On the one hand, we have the positional pivot, who enacts a very precise role, driven by a set of parameters given to the team by the coach. And on the other hand, we have a more open-ended approach, where rather than the team being given a specific dynamic, it emerges from the natural tendencies of the players, or more accurately, the synergies that develop between them. Because more than individual qualities, it really is the synergy between two players that we're talking about here, and as a concept that is much harder to break down. So much of what Pedri and De Jong do escapes analysis. It simply emerges as a result of spontaneous connection on the pitch, giving the team its unique rhythm and balance. However, the flip side of that is that this version of Barcelona only really exists when both De Jong and Pedri play together. Lose Pedri and Barca become less capable of shifting between stable possession and disruptive combinations. Lose De Jong, who is in constant connection with his partner, and those situations aren't accessed as frequently, which highlights both the benefits and challenges of this player-first approach. On the one hand, if your team is reliant on specific players and synergies, that becomes problematic over a long season, where you have to deal with rotations and injuries. But on the other hand, you have the undeniable magic of such a partnership. Especially as clubs pump hundreds of millions into new signings, trying to find specific profiles that fit the coach's specific tactical system. Instead, perhaps it's possible to maximize the qualities that you already have by finding the synergies between players and building your team around those synergies. Now, of course, I know what many of you will be thinking. That's easy to say when you're working with elite players like Jong and Pedri, but can you really do it with far lesser players? But to those people, I say, you're missing the point. No matter what approach you take to football, one thing remains constant. To achieve great things, you need great players. Whether you're coaching the most rigid positional play or something radically different, footballers still need a technical and physical foundation. The question is, once you have those things, how do you then maximize the potential of your team? Well, let's consider the situation of Frenkie de Jong specifically. For a long while, de Jong was heavily criticized by analysts. Under Xavi Hernandez, for example, he was often considered a tactical burden, going against the mechanics of the system and the parameters of a pivot. Getting dragged to the ball rather than staying in position, spending too long on it rather than passing. But then the situation was flipped, and rather than de Jong being shoehorned into a tactical blueprint, his specific qualities became the foundation of the team dynamic. The very same things he was criticized for formed the basis of his partnership with Pedri. At the same time, it's often asserted that top-down tactics protects weaker players who need that framework to perform, but consider how often the opposite happens, where players' weaknesses are actually exposed because they're asked to fulfill a niche role as part of the coach's master plan. And this is the massive risk clubs take when coaches try to solve problems from the top down. Yes, engineering a system with specific requirements can be extremely powerful, but if that system doesn't function or you sign the wrong profiles for it, the results can be catastrophic, both competitively and financially. So the question is, who will try the alternative route? In a world that is built on engineering, how many will invest in something far less tangible, in the development of human connection and synergy? Because perhaps it's not the machine itself, but the ghost within it that holds the key to a better game. In my latest bonus podcast, I discuss how Barcelona's transfer window might affect the footballing dynamic for this season. To hear it, you can become a Patreon member for just $2 a month or $12 for a whole year and get access to all my bonus content. If you don't want to pay, you can also become a free member for access to my community channel, where I share all the resources and research I use to create these videos. So if you want to dive deeper into the world of football tactics and meta discussion, head over to the first link in the description. Thanks so much for watching, special thanks to all of my current members, and I'll see you again in the next one. Take care.